So I'd like to say a few things about my perspective on this matter. And I have to say that I don't know about you guys, but I was fascinated with the hearings today. And one of the fascinating things about the hearings is how important words are and terms. So things like bribery, abuse of power, and what impeachment is, they're not just words. They're terms that have a history. They have almost a materiality, and a materiality because they matter. And in that way, I think words do matter. For me, I have to make a full disclosure that I don't like space. I don't like the term, and I never have. I think on the whole, it is at best general, and it's most often vague, and it is quite often vacuous. So I guess the way I think it's important to make that disclosure, and I won't use the term space as something which is positive. It is, and I won't try to even imagine what the thing is in a positive way. What I'm most interested in doing with this discussion is to try to frame it, to look at its context, to look at its uses, and look at its history. In other words, not what this thing is, but what it's done and what it does. I embarked on this project several years ago after teaching and hitting a point of exhaustion, coming into art schools and hearing students and professors talk about space. And I most often just didn't understand what they were talking about. So I would ask the students to humor me and not to use the word. And it was phenomenal how that cleaned up the conversation. So people had to actually think about what they were doing and think about much more precise terms. In fact, this afternoon I put together a list for anybody who might be persuaded or influenced by my distaste of the generality. These are all words that are alternatives to space in different locations. First one would be location, distance, volume, place, spot, room, gap, three-dimensionality, two-dimensionality, four-dimensionality, atmosphere, architecture, surroundings, ground, air, background, foreground, impression, corridor, gallery, hall, plenum, ether, gestalt, fog, void, shadow, hollow, outside, inside, square footage, cubic footage, projection, perspective, storage, home, interior, exterior, sphere, object relations, environment, nothingness, vacuum, glow, container, heavens, area, envelope, cosmos, universe, quintessence, spirit, platform, extension, vapor, effect, affect, and metric. I'm sure I could have come up with some more. Those are all alternative words. One other thing I'd like to say also before we get started is that because I don't like the term, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have uses. I can't think of another really proper term for outer space. And in mathematics and in physics, it is very much a real thing. And in honor of outer space and of Josiah, I have worn my T-shirt for Sun Ra Orchestra because space is the place. And Sun Ra has exquisite sense of what it means to find a line of flight from convention and oppression. But this is...
Tell it.
So when after finding that space was not a useful term, or not a very useful term in talking about art in conversation, I started to look at what this term really was. But first I started looking at when did it come into usage. And what was remarkable is there is scant mention of space in painting before 1900. And even more interesting, although it does make sense, is in architecture, space is not a term until really the 1920s. So using space in the arts in painting precedes a type of architectural thinking that includes space as part of the discourse. And in a way, that makes sense, because really space is pure convention. And in painting, it is only conventional. In architecture, it has become so wedded that you can barely talk about architecture without bringing space into it. And I would suggest that there's a continuity between the type of rationalization of space so that it can be measured and commodified on the one hand, and on the other hand, it serves as a type of decorative architectural flourish on the other. So if you have an extra clear story, people will throw that in, architects will throw that in rather than work on actually adjusting the use and proportions of a particular room. Another thing that was fascinating about the convention of space in the 19th century is there was a lot of investigation about what this thing was. And it turns out that there was even a group of science sociologists who called themselves psychophysics, physicists, who looked at how conceptions of space happen. So if we think about what our impressions of the world are and how we think about space, they're quite different. So I think everybody in this room can imagine, if I say, imagine that I'm holding a 1 foot by 1 foot cube of air right here. That's a post-19th century spatialist exercise. During the 19th century, many of these people assumed that this Euclidean geometric overlay of experience was a sign of advancement in societies. So it was used as a way of defining cultures as being primitive and cultures as being advanced. So when we think about space, it's not a neutral thing. It is something which is completely it's ethnocentric, and it's something that's become habit. And I think one of the issues with that I have with the term space is this is not acknowledged. It's considered an archetype that is true for the past and for different societies, whereas it's not necessarily so. Also, when I started in on this essay, there were some absolutely fascinating things that I embarked on. And I forgot to give props out to my son, Louis, who, as I got involved with the mathematics of space in the 19th century, I had no idea. He's actually a proper mathematician and would explain to me what the difference is between hyperbolic, non-Euclidean geometry, and Euclidean geometry, and what n-dimensional spatial equations were and how they worked. So also thank you, Louis. But if there's a time, if the notion of space is not timeless, there is a moment when it comes into being within the discourse. And that was one of the more exciting things that happened, is to hunt down what moment and what caused space to become part of the aesthetic discourse. And it was quite fascinating, because I think I actually did find a documentary art historical link. But I don't know, maybe we should start. Enough of me. Let's have Josiah jump in, please, if that's okay. Yeah.
Well, I guess I'll just do my own very brief introduction. I guess what I'd like to do is just pay tribute to Jim's, the result of what Jim's research. I recommend very much reading the essay, and I think we'll cover some of the territory that's in the essay tonight, but what's fascinating in the actual text is the amount of historical proofs he uncovered and his taking on of the role of the historian, at least temporarily. And I'd like to pay tribute to his doing so, because as Faulkner and as Barack Obama also paraphrased often, the past is never dead and it's not even past. I think it's very important that artists, when they can, collaborate with the historians of the world to uncover what is happening today through looking at the past. We'll never understand what we're doing now if we don't do that. And I think that we all need to share in that effort around remaking the past. Every individual can participate in that. It's my belief. And I think that that one of the things that Jim alluded to that I'd just like to point out, just to begin the discussion, is that that when Jim speaks about being against space, one of the things that is implied is that the concept of space, not only as a kind of matter of linguistics, but as a conceptual concern, means it's there to create distance between us, and it's there to create ways of owning the world. And at the very least, it's there to debase painting, because basically the idea that painting exists to create a convincing representation of the world is a very, very limited idea of what painting is. I think painting is to create some new way of seeing, new way of understanding, and it's not to convince us of simply that what we see in front of us is really there. And just one I would like to put forward as just a final note here is just in tribute to also to Sun Ra, here's one little moment of positive space. So this is the voice of David Henderson. He's a poet here in New York, who in 1975 sang the words of Sun Ra, "Love in outer space." Sunrise, love in all its splendor, reaches out to a lover like me again. Sunrise and love, love, love everlasting. Sunrise, love in its splendor, speaks to me in metaphysical harmonies. We move to celestial rhythms rare, onward and outward to delight in the mysteries. Sunrise, love for the world to see. Sunrise in outer space, love for every face.
Well, that's that was exquisite, very, very beautiful. I guess I would point out that space is really contested territory, and I guess one of the things that that happened. I mean, it's always funny where to start. So let me back up a little bit and just read this. This is what Aristotle wrote in the 4th century before Common Era. Every sensible body is in place, and the kinds or differences of place are up, down, before, behind, right, left, and these distinctions hold not only in relation to us and by arbitrary agreement, but also in the whole itself. But in the infinite body, they cannot exist. In general, if it is impossible that there should be an infinite place, and if every body is in place, there cannot be an infinite body. Now, I don't know, I mean, I'm sure there are people in this audience who are smarter than I am, but I have no idea what he's talking about. I don't know. Does anybody? And this is Aristotle, who was the chief authority for space through the Renaissance. It's only with Bruno and Galileo that that Aristotle's authority on these matters begins to wane. So I wanted to read that because it really is it is a strange thicket of ideas. So when you have people talking about ether and plenum, it is the terminology is quite strange, and these people are trying to make sense of this concept, and the concept seems to be sort of pulled between cosmology, religion, and nascent science.
Jim, it's not so long. Can you read it one more time?
Okay. Everybody, not everybody, every body is in place, and the kinds or differences of place are up, down, before, behind, right, left. And these distinctions hold not only in relation to us and by arbitrary agreement, but also in the whole itself. But the infinite body cannot exist. In general, if it is impossible that there should be an infinite place, and if every body is in place, there cannot be an infinite body. I just find that very bizarre. And there's a term called that people throw around, Cartesian space, but Descartes is barely as clear as even though he is genuinely trying to make sense of things and does at least formulate things clearer. This is Descartes in 1644. This is 2 millennia or so after. Is that right? My math? Yeah, just about that. After Aristotle, a body's being extended in length, breadth, and depth in itself warrants the conclusion that it is a substance, since it is a complete contradiction that a particular extension should belong to nothing, and the same conclusion must be drawn with respect to a space that is supposed to be a vacuum, substance in it as well. I can read that again.
Yeah, one more time.
A body's being extended in length, breadth, and depth in itself warrants the conclusion that it is a substance, since it is a complete contradiction that a particular extension should belong to nothing, And the same conclusion must be drawn with respect to a space that is supposed to be a vacuum, substance in it as well. So I'm reading these not because they're giving you information about people's concept of space, because as I say, anytime you hear me say space, you can put the scare quotes, imagine the scare quotes around them. But I just wanted to, I think these citations make clear that it's a very difficult and unclear term. Even into what we assume is a type of geometric clarity with Descartes. Actually, do we want to show a slide, or if we go back to go to that guy right there? Yeah. I think this is when things start to get a little bit clearer, or at least more useful in terms of geometricizing experience and our surrounding environment. Oops, we can stick on that one. This is a drawing from Newton's Principia Mathematica, and it's interesting to note the difference between the slide we had up further, which was a medieval view of the cosmos, with what I think is hell in the middle, with its maw, a green ring, which is Earth, blue skies, a circle, which is orange, which would be sunshine, and outer space unfolding, and then God surrounding it all. With this image, there's a type of archetypal math going on. So in fact, it's not even math. It's a type of geometry which is fundamental to what the cosmos is. With Newton, there is a real break with that idea. Math is no longer, or geometry is no longer, the foundation for the cosmos. It is a tool in order to describe what we see, and that is a fundamental shift. And what he does is if I could simplify it, is he puts a Euclidean geometric overlay on top of experience and on top of the physical world. And it proves very, very useful. And in fact, he calls it absolute space. And absolute space is becomes an enormously powerful tool. But unlike Sun Ra, which is bringing us all together, this was very controversial at the time, and Gottfried Leibniz referred to Newton's space as mere chimeras and superficial imaginations, grounded upon supposition that imaginary space is real. And he continues, space is nothing else but the order of the existence of things, observed as existing together, and therefore a fiction of material finite universe, moving forward in an infinite empty space, cannot be admitted. It is altogether unreasonable and impractical. These are imaginations of philosophers who have incomplete notions, who make space an absolute reality. Mere mathematicians who are only taken up with the conceits of imagination are apt to forge such notions, but they are destroyed by superior reasons. So that is so that at this point in the 17th century, there is a real contradiction between people who find it so useful that it must be real, and people who are so convinced that this is simply a fiction and is not addressing the essence of things.
Jim, before we get too far ahead in history, can you tie this back to the language of painting in that period and the previous couple hundred years? You know, because we skipped from Aristotle through the Middle Ages, and now we're at the 18th century. But let's ground it in what I think is a really important point that we've talked about quite a bit before, which was that the development of one-point perspective, the development of perspectival imagery in painting had absolutely nothing to do with space, and as you're discussing it, and certainly was not about was not driven by a desire to make a mathematically correct painting, but had much higher, greater aims. Could you talk about that?
Well, I think during the Renaissance, the higher aims and the mathematics were quite related, because coming from the Greeks, mathematics was a beautiful truth that was the underlying structure of the world and of the cosmos. But certainly the reason I'm not quoting people speaking about space in art in the Renaissance is it does not exist. It just really isn't there. I have a minor quote by Alberti, who was certainly one of the great geniuses of the age, and was the one who formalized Brunelleschi's invention of perspective. And he mentions space in his talk about painting, but when he talks about it, he only uses the word space to denote intervals. And at one point, he describes setting up a situation and drawing it on the painter's space. But if you look at the Latin translation, space in that sense means the flat surface of the painting or the paper on which the mathematics is inscribed. So to get back to what Josiah was saying, there is a sense that by using math, using proper proportion, you are, as an artist, fulfilling the godly task of making art, which is the child of humans, and as humans, we are the children of God. So it is very, very different than what Panofsky writes about in the 20s, which is jumping ahead, where he states that the goal, the reason for perspective was to create a believable space. Whereas this is the construction of perspective was, I think, more to show the world, to show both other humans and God that there are specific relationships which are correct and are beautiful, and the correctness and the beauty are proportion, and the act of inscribing these things is a beautiful and serious thing to do.
Jim, I'm just mindful of where we're sitting, and we're sitting in a school with a grand history of teaching questions around proportion, for example. Could you explain a little bit more because I do think that from a commonplace understanding of the word space, one would assume that perspective could involve space. And I think it's actually really revelatory and deeply important that your clarification that actually perspective does not involve space. And you have explained this to me in a way that I found deeply fascinating and quite practical, which is by taking two objects and talking about the fact that perspective is about the appropriate size of these two in relationship to each other, but not about this thing in between them. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think that's this is the idea. I think perspective relates to the ideas of proper proportion, so that things are measured and given their place. So diminution is related to how this size should be related to that size. This size should be related to that. So there is a type of idealism at work with perspective.
And that plays into the ultimate goal of what the painting is trying to do, which is to show the ideal.
And the harmonious relationship of God to nature to mankind. But I think the other thing that's always important to remember is that art, painting, and drawing precede all of this nonsense, so that you give an artist a problem and we run with it. And the fascination and joy of these perspectival works is exceptional. We can feel these people on the verge of discovery, and how exciting this moment is. And it's replicated in subsequent movements, although I don't know if there's anything quite as radical as that concerning conceptions of measurement, perhaps until Cubism.
So bringing us forward to Cubism, Jim, maybe we could just looking at time, thinking about maybe we now should skip forward from the fact that in the 18th century, what might be called science, philosophy, physics, all being one thing really, has a huge problem with what space, quote unquote, space might be, and thereby space is a contested notion altogether. And then we come to this new idea where space has a new life, or maybe you would say its first real life in the notion of the fourth dimension and the mathematics that then become of deep interest to artists as well. So maybe we skip forward to the tesseract in the fourth dimension.
Yeah, we can take a look at that. That is, so I found one of the most interesting and kind of counterintuitive things about how space made its entrance into discussing art was that it did so via Cubism and the fourth dimension, which may seem counterintuitive. I guess we're taught that perspective equals space, but what does four dimensions equal? And it equals a type of conundrum. Let me see if there's a quote by Apollinaire, who was a great apologist for all things new and was quite clever. And this is 1912. Nowadays, scientists have gone beyond the 3 dimensions of Euclidean geometry. Painters have been led, quite naturally, and one might say intuitively, to take an interest in the new possibilities of measuring space, which in the modern artist's studio were simply and collectively referred to as the 4th dimension. Now, it is with the publication of Cubist broadsides and manifestos that we start seeing space take place within the context of discourses about art, and specifically discourses about painting. And if we could actually go to the
other one.
Yeah, we could. If we could do, we do Brock first.
Okay.
Or we could do Picasso first, whichever.
Okay. Okay.
We're missing part of the diagram. And let me see if I can find the.
Maybe I can.
Take care of
You
that.
want me to?
Yeah.
Try to find that?
Okay. So on the left is a book from I think 1903, if I'm reading it right, and a painting by Brock on the right from 1909. And the book on the left, it was said was shown to Picasso and Brock. Part of the group of artists at the early in the 20th century that formed the core of the Bateau Lavoir. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but they included Picasso, Brock, Gertrude Stein, Sonia Delaunay. They included the Duchamps, Gilles, and Metzinger. And they also included an insurance actuary, Maurice Princet. And Princet was a avid follower of advanced mathematics and was particularly interested in the mathematics of higher dimensions. So in the late 19th century, there was a German mathematician who worked out the mathematics of computing forms in an infinite number of dimensions. So those are called n-dimension equations. But as well, there is another strange type of mathematics, which is non-Euclidean geometry, where things bend and don't perform like we are taught to think of them. Although, if we had more time, I'd make an argument that living on the sphere of the Earth, we actually inhabit a non-Euclidean elliptical space. But that's, we don't have time for that. But we can take a look at the Picasso. This is also that from that same book. And there was the, let me see, the hostile critic who coined Cubism, Louis Vassels, again, and he was quite good at coining names. He also coined Fauvism to to slam the extreme colorists of that moment. But here is what he writes in 1918. Princet, who is the insurance actuary and mathematician, studied at length non-Euclidean geometry and the theorems of Riemann, of which Gliese and Metzinger speak rather carelessly. Now then, Monsieur Princet one day met Monsieur Max Jacob and confided to him one or two of his discoveries relating to the fourth dimension. Monsieur Jacob informed the ingenious Monsieur Picasso of it, and Monsieur Picasso saw there was a possibility of new ornamental schemes. Monsieur Picasso explained his intentions to Monsieur Apollinaire, who hastened to write them up in formularies and codify them. The thing spread and propagated. Cubism, the child of Monsieur Princet, was born. Now we do know that the image on the right was from a book that Princet owned. We don't have any definitive document that he showed it to Picasso, but I think it looks, the visual is convincing enough, at least for me. So this it's quite fascinating how space becomes the place of flight from convention and from norms. So in this case, space enters art as this wild, eccentric invention. You know, so much that one of the reasons Apollinaire wrote all these defenses for Cubism is people really hated it when it was shown in various public places. There was a movement among politicians to deny them public funding. So it continues.
So Jim, just to sort of put a pin in it here. So you're basically what you're claiming here and putting forward evidence of. I mean, in the sense of what Vassell writes is that basically that these scientific theories around the fourth dimension, which in this case there being multiple ideas around the fourth dimension, including in theosophy, but in math, it's basically the way that form is transformed as it moves, and there's arguments about whether this has to do with time or not, doesn't have to do with time, and whether it has to do with space or doesn't have to do with space, but it's basically as geometric form moves from one geometric form to another, the way it's transformed as it turns or alters itself from one form to another, and that these theories are actually being used to actually form the depictions of space that or the depictions of the world in Cubism. And this is, instead of being basically a kind of invention from the studio, a kind of lightning struck on the head of the artist alone in the studio, that these are directly taken from the world of ideas around them, and in fact the most current and argued about scientific ideas of the day.
Yeah, I think that's true. There at the time, the fourth dimension was part of the general scientism that was taking root around Paris, for example. There were, I think, over 1,000 publications that would have recorded the various advancements in physics and mathematics, so that it was basically available to the public. So the imagining of the fourth dimension could mean several things, it seems. It could mean a type of spiritual dimension where there's a type of feeling of something which is not in the rational Euclidean field of experience. It also became space-time, so that time became the fourth dimension. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there was a type of mathematical foundation where geometry and geometric figures could be imagined in multiple dimensions.
I mean, one of the things that this is a slide of Hilma af Klint's work, and one of the most popular blockbuster shows in the history of New York City, all driven by word of mouth. The museum, Guggenheim Museum, had not planned on the exhibition being popular at all, and it was her work, completely unknown to the audience, that drove a word of mouth frenzy. And one of the things that's confusing about her work is that basically while she herself might have in times framed her work as being in great part informed by higher powers, it's well documented by her own 25,000 pages of notes on her work that much of her work is informed by the most current scientific theories. And it's very evident visually and in, like I said, in her notes. And it's interesting that we want to reduce art and ideas to their most simplistic form. And I think that the idea that perspective is there to create a convincing representation of the world is another example of the horrible reductionism that seemingly is always being put forward. This is another, I guess that didn't work, sorry.
So the diagram on the left is also from the book by Esprit Geoffret that was in circulation, and it was the diagrams, as is this one.
And then this I just thought mention, which is interesting. Sonia Delaney's work, who's only really begun to really feel her full impact of her work, sort of a la af Klint today. This is an example of her work in the period where she has begun to develop her ideas of simultaneity, which is a kind of idea of how the worlds of the exterior, the worlds of painting, the worlds of the interior, the worlds of the body, the worlds of fashion, and everything could be kind of collapsed and be connected at the same moment. So I think ideas of temporal shifts, spatial shifts, in that sense, were being played with by many, many artists.
No, and of course, since, as we've discussed, space is a contested territory.
You want to do the Los or this one?
Let's do this one. We could. Actually, the first fine articulation of space and art that I found did not have to do with the fourth dimension. It was it was from a sculptor in the late 19th century, von Hildenbrand, and that is his sculpture on the left. And he went to school and taught in an academy not far from where Immanuel Kant taught and lived his life. And he proposes space as a type of urgency. And it's very different than fourth dimensional space. It's a notion that space means 3 dimensions for him, and that it is an actual concrete or real thing. Although when I hear real space, I usually think real estate, but artists are always dealing with real estate. But if I can find the quote, basically, Kant is very persuasive in coming up with the modern idea of space, in that he says we can imagine, if we can imagine objects, we've already imagined a background. So we can imagine the background without the objects, but we can't imagine the objects without a background. So for Kant, and this is maybe going out into the weeds a little bit, but for Kant, space is a necessary background for all representation. I guess the parallel would be if you have a drawing, you can't imagine the drawing without the paper behind it. So for Kant, space becomes the universal background, but exists only as representation. And if you look at it historically, people were imagining objects without the background for many millennia before Kant. Anyway, this is von Hildebrand was latched on to this, and I have this image here on the left. I don't know if you see Philoctetes' foot that he's holding in pain. So the legend of Philoctetes is that he offended Hera, and she sent a snake and bit Philoctetes' foot. Now the foot is not broken off. He cuts the foot and leaves it empty. And I would just like to add, there's a fundamental difference in etymology between the German word for space and the Latin word for space. In spatium implies interval or extension, or even a plane, whereas Raum comes from Raumen, which means to evacuate or to move away. So when Hildebrand in the 1890s comes up with his writing about space, he sees it as a type of real space, which is different than Kant, and it is actually quite a conservative idea of space. It's not that space is like for Hilma af Klint or for Picasso or for the various utopian artists who used it as a way to escape convention. Space is the binding and I would say almost absolute convention. After the heyday of Cubism, there was a backlash. And many people, including Duchamp and even Apollinaire, can be discovered writing that, well, fourth dimension was really an excess. These utopian flights, it never really made sense visually. So you have Ozenfant and his partner as a purist, who was Jenrette, who became better known as Le Corbusier, who forged purism. And it's in their writings and in their manifestos, they say space means 3 dimensions. And this is an important goal of painting because the architectonic whole of the picture must be kept intact. This is during the return to order. And I put these two things together because while Hildebrand had this very articulate Kantian notion of space, it never moved beyond regional Germany. It was the fourth dimension that made it a thing. But with the return to order, both Hildebrandt's sculpture and his idea of space become more successful. And furthermore, if you search the documents, which I have, it is fascinating that Le Corbusier will write about space in painting before he writes about it in architecture.
Do we want to open it to questions now,
Yeah.
Or do you want to do this? Or
Yeah, we just, since we're in architecture, you want to take that away?
Oh, well, I'll just briefly introduce this idea, and then Jim can finish it up, and then we'll do some open up questions. Basically, I guess Jim wanted to, in his essay, compares these two famous places. Not spaces, places. One is the Villa Müller by Adolf Loos in 1930, which is famous for being one of the first houses designed where one's perception of space, if you will, or volumetric experience is how the house is designed, as opposed to its kind of structure. And then, strangely, this cubist, quote-unquote cubist house that's designed by the Duchamp family ends up looking not very cubist, but rather quite traditional, because in some sense it's designed simply through, not through a kind of using the implications of the fourth dimension a la cubism, but actually simply the kind of traditional plan and section approach to architecture that had been prevalent for many hundreds of years, and simply adding a kind of set of angled additions. If that sounds right, Jim.
Yeah, what is, and I think what those two pictures show is why people maybe got fed up with the fourth dimension. It was hard to, it was a difficult workable thing. I would like to say that Loos actually, when he designed this, actually came up with his own notion of personal branding of space, which was called Raumplan. And it was, he talks about it as a cubic way of designing habitations. So what is fascinating with our inheritance of how we think about decoration, how we think about volume, how we think about architecture, the Loos seems quite advanced or more contemporary in terms of spatiality, whereas the Duchamp villa seems just pretty basic bourgeois.